Thank you, everyone, for waking up so early and getting here. And this is our first panel, which is 6 Pedagogical Manifestos. 7 Pedagogical Manifestos. And our moderator and respondent for this is Alan Balfour. Alan Balfour is kind of a dean squared, or maybe even more. He's currently dean at Georgia Tech. Before that, he was the architecture dean at Rensselaer. Before that, the chairman of the Architectural Association in London, and then architecture dean at Rice University in Houston. He's the author of a number of books, including a series about 3 cities, Shanghai, New York, and Berlin. Another book about Berlin, The Politics of Berlin, The Politics of Order. And his most recent book is about Jerusalem, called Solomon's Temple, Myth, Conflict, and Faith. And I also want to remind you about the other sessions that we've lined up for today. After the Manifestos panel will be one titled Challenges and Opportunities, looking at the forces that are reshaping architecture and architectural education in all directions. Lunch discussions, and after that, changing academic economies, which I think is a topic of interest to all administrators. And then the final panel for today is going to be regulatory changes. And again, what was the subtitle to that? Help or hindrance. After that, we hope that you'll all take the subway downtown to hear Tom Main, and then come to our reception at the Bradbury Building. Thank you. Alan.
Margaret, thank you. I think Margaret's a sense of humor. Manifestos are the first thing from my mind. I think we've all been set up. It's going to be very interesting. I will introduce the speakers, and Norman will wave his hands when they're said too much. And to begin, just a reminder, a manifesto is a public declaration of principles and intentions, often political in nature. And to the speakers, Daniel Friedman. Daniel is Dean of the College of the Built Environment at the University of Washington. Formerly, he served as Director of the School of Architecture at the University of Illinois in Chicago, and before that, directed the School of Architecture and Interior Design in Cincinnati. He serves on the boards of the Seattle Art Museum, the Cascade Land Conservatory, the American Architectural Foundation, Places, and is a past president of ECSA. His PhD is from Penn. He maintains registration in Ohio and Illinois, and he's been a fellow of the AIA since 2001. Daniel Friedman.
And despite all that, scared to death. Thank you so much, Alan, and thank you to our organizers for the opportunity to join you this morning. No manifesto here, I'm afraid, but I'm happy to share a few observations and questions that might provide a context for the manifestos that follow. To the extent I understand the manifesto, despite the beautifully delivered definition, it derives from the word that means obvious, so I can at least contribute observations on the obvious. My point of departure is a remark issued by William Gibson at the first NE conference 21 years ago. I think Bob Somol was in the audience. William Gibson said, "If the people who are currently building nanotechnology and virtual reality have their way with us, I think that what we think of today as architecture will be considered as something like classical music. I don't think architecture will even be an issue if technology runs the course it's currently setting for itself." And I'll come back to this in just a minute. So the context of our problem from my limited perspective. ACSA programs serve about 28,000 students. They graduate them at a rate of 4,000 or 5,000 a year into a market that's only supporting 70% of the 100,000 or so registered architects in the United States. There's no significant sign of relief for this situation, given projections of a cheese-paring 1.5% increase in our gross domestic product as we slog out of this long hollow. And to the great majority of practitioners I talk with, most are worried about the future, as I think we are. Higher education is under siege. especially public higher education. I think almost everybody's budget is smaller, probably significantly smaller. I live in a particularly rough state. Without going into its problems, I can tell you about our problems. We're one of 16 colleges, about a third off the bottom in size, and we've cut our operating budget 34% in 3 years. We've cut 7 administrative FTE and 2 associate dean positions, which really, truly hurts. Our salaries and travel are frozen for the 3rd year in a row. The state's predicting another revenue shortfall of $2 billion. We have no income tax in the state of Washington. And we have retention pools to help stanch the bleeding and migration of talent to other universities, but everybody's really worried. It's fair to say that in almost every state except North Dakota, legislatures are tightening their grip on higher ed, scaling back appropriations, and business-driven, activity-based budget models are proliferating, which is both good and bad. An activity-based budget model is a budget model that gives all revenues to their source and then taxes them for overhead, in our case, 30%. The good thing is that the good thing about ABB is it gives more control over individual units in the development and management of their budgets. They're less dependent on the mysterious alchemy of provosts who distribute funds centrally. The bad thing is that it forces us to operate our colleges like a business. It forces us to direct a disproportionately large amount of our energy to the management of that budget, and maybe even more threatening, to the development of fee-based entrepreneurship, which is not much different from open access for-profit diploma mills, only by degrees. And I just opened the Chronicle of Higher Education, and this is the lead story, almost every issue. So it's clear that the general intellectual trends in our business suggest that we need to adjust our assumptions about economies, energy, climate, urbanization, and that the old methodologies will eventually give way to new ways of working, more concerned with systems, supply chains, data, and both institutional and physical resilience. All of these new methodologies suggest the need for a third epistemology, which hybridizes empirical and analogical reasoning, opening up a more fruitful horizon for collaboration among designers, scientists, and engineers, not to mention developers, builders, and bankers. So within this context, I do not fear for design, and I will leave the problem of design to others in this room and on this panel. I believe design and all of its implications will take care of itself. What I do fear is the further and possible irremediable estrangement of design from other aspects of regulated building production, especially construction and finance, which drive our industry, define the locus of control, and determine the distribution of risk and reward, including and especially intellectual risk and reward. So back to Gibson. Let's say Gibson's right, and I think the signs point in that direction for architecture conventionally understood. That is, as a regulated profession with a protected title and accredited curricula. I guess we can continue to sustain about 1,000 professional classical musicians in the top 10 urban markets. And these classical musicians will increasingly depend on philanthropy to operate and perform. That's about the same number of students currently enrolled in professional degree programs at Harvard, Yale, Columbia, Cornell, Princeton, and Penn, which have an aggregate endowment of about $90 billion. If you assume that's 3% of all the students who are currently enrolled, let's round that out to 10% in consideration of Michigan and Berkeley and other really good programs. Let's assume that 10% fall out the bottom. So let's talk about the middle 80%. What happens to them? What's the nature of our responsibility to them in this debate? My concern, if I offered one idea to this discussion, is we should accelerate our exploration of ways to integrate, to reduce the intern development component of licensure and fully integrate it into the curriculum. Because sure as we're sitting here, this new emerging generation of students will find the nature of practice very interesting indeed, and they'll be able to bring back what they discover to our studios and classrooms with great consequence for our programs. Let me end with one more number, 28. That's both the percentage of adult Americans who have at least a bachelor's degree and vote based on that education, and it's the percentage of full-time teachers of architecture who have a license to practice.
Daniel, before you sit down, can you sort of sum up? I mean, there was a manifesto in there.
How many minutes?
It's a little over 6.
Oh,
You're doing very well. Can you sum up in one sentence? There is a manifesto in there. Can you give us a kind of capsule piece to take away?
One sentence? I'm going to play on this. In one sentence, I'll play on the title of a book of interviews with Richard Rorty published posthumously. I'm just going to pun on the title. Take care of building, and architecture will take care of itself.
Good. Thank you, Daniel. And now, I think, Bill, yes. I follow orders here, but Bill, Dr. William W. Braham, FAIA, is an associate professor of architecture at University of Pennsylvania and director of the Master of Environmental Building Design. He has an engineering degree from Princeton, and his MArch and PhDs are from Penn. At Penn, he teaches graduate courses in ecology, technology, and design. He practices with the T.C. Chan Center and works with companies such as Evalo Lighting and Lutron Electronics. At the Chan Center, his recent projects have been concerned with the sustainability plan and carbon reduction plan for the university. He's also contributed to the Greater Philadelphia Innovation Cluster on energy-efficient buildings. There's a symposium being planned, which will be called Architecture and Energy. And other books in which he's considered these issues include Rethinking Technology, a Reader in Architectural Theory. Less related to energy is, perhaps it was his PhD dissertation, Modern Color, Modern Architecture, Amadei aux Enfants, and the Genealogy of Color in Modern Architecture. Bill?
Thank you, Alan. And in case it wasn't obvious from that, I was invited here as the environmental guy. I am happy to be that. I'm happy to represent that point of view, and I'm going to talk, I suppose, in a manifesto-like manner, but really to describe the pedagogy that led to the formation of a post-professional degree program we're now offering for the last 2 years. And I suppose the manifesto terms would be what's on the screen: ecology, technology, and design. But I have to start by saying I've been teaching subjects like this for now 30 years, and I'm so used to walking into rooms or meeting people at parties and having them expect that they already know full well exactly what I'm going to tell them, and if I tell them anything different, then I must be lying. What I mean by that is environmental design broadly has been, by definition, defined as a marginal practice, meaning it is the class of practices that are just beyond or just outside contemporary practices that involve some sort of reduction, some sort of conservation, or conversion to renewables. Once, for example, solar cells become ubiquitous on roofs, they are no longer considered to be part of environmental design. They are part of architecture, and environmental design moves forward. So people expect that this topic will involve exhortations to their renouncing things, to the increases in efficiencies, to changes in renewables, all of which are fine and good things, all of which are, I would argue, a piece of the work. But in fact, one of the biggest challenges we have, both with students and I think with the field, is recognizing that that in fact is an entirely self-limiting way of approaching the question. So we formed this program specifically to help architects after they've achieved their professional accreditation, and in fact we've aimed this at architects after they've been out and practicing, hopefully licensed, not always, specifically to allow them to retool and rethink what they're doing related to what we're calling environmental building design. And as you would imagine, this involves an awful lot of building simulation analysis, a lot of building physics. I'm just showing you on the screen the array of things which we think of as the, I guess, is the hard spine of this particular program: climate simulation, energy analysis, computational fluid dynamics, integrated design, and of course the challenge for them, when I use the word design, the challenge for this group of students, and I think the profession generally, is that's such an overwhelming new array of tools and concepts that design often gets left to the side. And in fact, what happens is they revert to, and I would argue we are broadly stuck in the notion that what they're trying to accomplish is exactly the things I described at the beginning, or only the things I described at the beginning. Some form of renunciation, different kinds of efficiencies, and switches to renewables. Again, all good things, but not adequate goals in themselves. The challenge, and this has been, for me at least, the most interesting part of this program over the last couple of years, is first as we develop it and now as we have students in it, is to take up exactly the opposite questions from the ones they expect and from the ones I'm expected to teach about. And it's to, first of all, understand what it means to design from within the wealthiest civilization that has existed on the face of the earth, that it has more power at its capacity, and to not deny the pleasures of those or the wonder, I suppose I would say, of those, but, and in fact to understand that that's what people do. So that environmental design has to take that not just as a condition to be cured, but as the condition of its work, as the condition of all of our work. And so we start, of course, following good ecological authors, trying to understand how the human economy, of which architects and the construction industry sit properly within that, but how that sits within the larger ecosystems, of course, providing limits, also providing opportunities and strategies. We pull that down as quickly as we can, because these are architects, to the building level to try and understand really at the end of the day what is going on in buildings. And although we know very well what goes on in some aspects of buildings as architects, there are many, that whole fantastic invisible world of resource flows, power and wealth of a variety of different kinds that in fact make our work possible. I mean, it is easy to forget that architecture is itself a luxury, and a luxury that exists on top of a vast network of support that in fact makes it possible. Even with that, of course, the premise remains both with students and I would say generally that one is still simply trying to achieve a kind of efficiency. One is simply trying to make things better, and the environmentalist is the one who shows up to take the fun out of architecture. And again, I think this is precisely the problem, precisely the self-limiting aspect. So the thing we have found most useful and also the most challenging for students is to even back up one step further and to understand the degrees to which the questions that on the one hand we consider to be environmental, and on the other hand, the ones that we consider to be architectural, both operate within quite easily understood, although maybe difficult to quantify in some cases and analyze, the kinds of fantastic hierarchies, I'm calling them socioeconomic hierarchies, following a very good anthropologist we've been reading lately. Because, of course, architecture is itself both a product of all of these different means of production, and equally a symbol of them, a symbol of status of different kinds, and also a display, a quite proper display of different degrees of wealth. So thinking that through is the thing that most confounds the students, but I also believe is the thing that most thoroughly prepares them to take on the deeper question of what is sustainable design, what is environmental building design, and how do we think about that. So I honestly can't show you an example of that, but I think the operative terms, ecology, technology, and design would be the manifesto. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. Again, sure. I would love to think there's a sort of, I may find myself asking everyone the same question.
Yeah.
A kind of a one statement. Is it architecture, environmentalists take the fun out of architecture? Is that the, that is a manifesto-like quality to it.
That's the hook.
That's
No, honestly, I would say, in fact, it's an exact, it's a disagreement with a statement a colleague of mine made many years ago, which was that a very good environmentalist, that architects should stop building buildings that represented wealth and power, which I would imagine drew a line through the entire history of architecture. Yeah. So architects do exactly that.
Very good. Thank you very much. And now I will go down in order as sitting. Dagmar Richter. Dagmar currently chair of Cornell's the Department of Architecture, but will assume the position of chair of the undergraduate program at Pratt in January. Educated at the Technical University of Stuttgart, the Royal Academy in Copenhagen, and the Stadtschule in Frankfurt. She has practiced and taught throughout Europe and the US, including Oslo, Berlin, Boston, New York, Los Angeles. She has held professorships at, among other places, Harvard, the Rhode Island School of Design, Cooper Union, Columbia, Art Academy in Berlin. She is the principal of DR/D, a design practice known for its inventive design approaches and research-oriented experiments. Her work has gained numerous prizes and awards and is the subject of 2 monographs, XYZ, The Architecture of Dagmar, and Armed Surfaces, Architecture and Urbanism. She's been published and exhibited widely, and she has works in the Louisiana Art Museum in Copenhagen, the Centre Pompidou in Paris, and the Armand Hammer Museum in Los Angeles. Dagmar Richter.
Thank you. Thank you so much for getting up so early this morning. You seem to be all already awake. I will try to make this very brief with no images. And I would like to say that we're back again in the Gothic environment in architecture. And I do not mean that stylistically, where architects design emo cutlery tables or tea sets for the contemporary Adams family who can afford to be eccentric. I mean a time where the conception of architecture is less involved with the art of representation and much more engaged with imagining and collectively participating in the construction of an architectural artifact in a one-to-one environment. There was once a time like that, the first Gothic era, where architectural representation was not that useful. As a guild of participants were constructing a building together under often changing leadership in a one-to-one process. To move forward, I'd like to venture beyond the classic dichotomy of old school versus new school. It might be helpful for the future architectural designer to, 1, learn technological, digital, logistical skills to foster domain competence. I would say that is new school. Without relying solely on technocratic solution-based model with the ideal cost-benefit relation. Let's face it, who do you define cost, or how do you define cost, and whose benefit? 2, to gain historical and theoretical knowledge to help foster political and cultural engagement. I'd say that is old school, without relying solely on inflexible ideologies. And 3, to be in an environment that fosters creativity, to support relevant new ideas, no school, because it's related on imagination, without relying on the notion of the single genius author. We have to teach the students to be able to be creative. That means to be able to create something new, but that's not enough. This something new has to have some kind of value, that it's relevant. This can be hardly achieved through solely technocratic solutions or pure novelty per se, new school, but with wisdom, old school, that only can come through knowledge of history and theory, for example. We have to teach the students to become responsible, dare I say old school, by acquiring the capacity to design the environmentally most advantageous and best performing solution, I'd say new school. We have to teach, or rather foster creativity, no school, an ability to depart from society's existing norms and values in order to create solutions for the future. Today, in a network creative global architectural design team where all information is available to multiple authors in a digital one-to-one environment at different locations around the globe, simultaneously reflecting different cultural aspirations, different education, different political systems, notions of propriety, it will be a grand challenge to properly educate the assumed leaders of the pack. In architectural education, we in the US have a major responsibility today, as we have been operating for a few decades nearly in a cultural monopoly, but who knows how much longer. The US has been recognized for their architectural education to be superior to most areas in the world, and I say most. There are a few other schools around the world which are recognized, of course. The best and most wealthy of the entire globe have followed US schools' marketing and are willing and able to pay many years' average earnings to get a recognized education for their offspring. From Asia, Africa, and Europe, to of course the US too, if you're hoping to become a leader in architectural design, you seem to aspire to receive your training mainly here within a handful of schools. Who's not looking for the top 10 in Design Intelligence report today? We try hard to include in our educational curriculum a multicultural world who still is looking towards us to provide the best education in architecture to be had. And we try hard to show off at least one representative each in our faculty, as long as they have gone through the recognized US top school training and are more than able to represent our cultural old school values, albeit with the help of new school digital tools. I am not convinced we have arrived at new school yet. Actually, probably more old school, just in digitally enhanced new emperor's clothes. Thank you.
Dagmar, hold on. Don't leave yet. Don't leave. Can you in capsule describe the quality, if you like, the manifesto of the new school?
The manifesto of the new school is the new Gothic.
Oh, that is
That we are in
thoroughly
a new
elliptical.
Gothic, in a new Gothic global environment.
There you go. Thank you very much. Dagmar, thank you. Darren is architect, professor, and director of the design school at Arizona State, where he also runs his applied research lab, SCAPE, Systems, Components, Architectural Products, and Environments. Founder and principal of AIR, Architectural Infrastructure Research, Inc. He received both a master's degree in architecture and master's degree in architecture and urban design, with distinction from Harvard University's Graduate School of Design. Darren.
Okay, well, I'm just going to get to it. The title of my, and I think it is maybe a manifesto after hearing the eloquent definition of it, is called Moving from Innovation to Transformation, 21st Century Design Education. The focus of the talk is at the intersection of what I see as contemporary students, programs, and practices. I'm going to start with contemporary students. Current child development research supports that there are 3 factors that have had a profound impact on our contemporary students: structured play, overscheduling, and the reduction of emotional intelligence. We first have to look back to the 1955 when the Mickey Mouse Club debuted on television. These small, uniformed soldiers single-handedly shifted active imaginative play to passive entertainment, teaching kids how to play. That same year, the Mattel Toy Company started to advertise their wares on television outside the holiday season. That was the first time that it happened. And practically overnight, children's play became focused on things or toys and entertainment or television. Remember the original Legos simply consisted of a series of different size colored building blocks that relied upon children's imagination to build structures. Today's children are playing with more specific Legos or close-ended toys that have pre-planned purposes or outcomes. We're finding that today's design students, when told how to do something, perform beautifully, but when left to their own devices, struggle with free play. Psychologists believe that changes in children's play have negatively impacted cognitive and emotional development. Because children's activities are now more regulated by adults, children are not able to practice self-regulating themselves. Self-regulation is a crucial developmental task. So developing imagination and creativity is essential for children to develop problem-solving skills, and as a result of free play reduction, children are developing problem-solving deficit disorder. We're finding that collaborative environments are cultivating free play and are greatly improve the student's emotional intelligence. Developmental neuroscience research provides evidence that free play actually helps students develop a critical cognitive skill called executive function. The brain's executive function has many features, the central one being the ability to self-regulate, and as I said, students who have good self-regulation are able to control their emotions and behavior, resist impulses, and exert self-control and self-discipline, and these are critical factors to successful collaborations. Now I want to talk about 21st century practice. I see 3 dominant trajectories in contemporary practice and what I would describe as absorption, appropriation, and redefinition. Absorption is evidenced by the growth of more super firms that combine multiple disciplines such as architecture, engineering, and construction. While these firms boast integrated one-stop shopping, they struggle internally to optimize collaboration across their services, typically leading to less experimentation and less significant contributions to the evolution of the larger project of architecture. The second trajectory is what I'd call appropriation. Here, consultants who perform measured services in the forms of research or analysis are assuming greater control, liability, and fees. Pre-design services are being appropriated by design thinking firms, such as, in this case, IDEO, who are now being hired to define the brief for the client and then give it to the architect. This is a shoe store that was designed by IDEO. Branding and communication companies are now competing for projects that require redefinition, identity development, and complex communication strategies. Here's Bruce Mau's winning competition for the Downsview Park in Toronto. And engineers are now venturing into turf normally reserved for architects. An example of this is the Advanced Geometry Unit at ARUPS. You all know Cecil Bellman. These consultants are also assuming greater control, liability, and fees. Energy simulation and structural design are beginning to replace building design. Advanced construction companies such as Mortenson are now brought on early in the design phase so that they can play an active role in the design and cost controls for the construction of a proposed building. And these companies more and more are controlling the model, i.e. the construction documents and the construction administration. And these are images of the BIM model that's produced by Mortenson for Daniel Libeskind's Denver Museum of Art. So if we look at a typical project delivery sequence, given the current trends, we have to ask the question, what's the role of the architect? Now, some firms, such as AMO, a design research studio inside OMA, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, are think tanks operating on the boundaries of architecture, media, politics, sociology, sustainability, technology, fashion, publishing, graphic design, etc. And here, AMO is leveraging architects' integrative ability to think qualitative and quantitatively as an approach to redefine problems and expand their role in the market. This is a transformative approach that's gaining back their practice in certain ways and expanding their conventional practice. So what are contemporary architecture programs focusing on? I see three dominant ways in which contemporary programs are expanding the discipline. Two of these are more established, and the third is maybe emerging. Design art, design construction, and design thinking. Expanding the discipline through form, illustrative modeling, and new digital tools and processes advance the discipline and ultimately the profession through formal innovation. Expanding the discipline through construction, design build programs promote building technologies and sustainability. These programs advance the discipline and profession through innovative modes of production. And expanding the discipline through design thinking, engaging complex problems and collaborative multidisciplinary teams advance the discipline and the profession by broadening the fields of problems engaged by architects and creating leaders of collaborations. So I propose a 21st century manifesto where students develop their emotional intelligence in multidisciplinary collaborative environments where they engage complex or wicked problems that result in transformative design solutions and that expand the boundaries of the discipline and ultimately the profession. So how do we move from a more conventional innovative education to a more transformative education? Conventional architectural education teaches innovation, and this is usually found in the undergraduate. Students work as individuals, following a brief, and are taught the conventions of the profession. So why should we move from a conventional innovative education to a more transformative education? Well, the global trajectory is demanding more multidisciplinary teams, transformative thinking, redefinition of problems, 21st century challenges, sustainability, optimization, communicating complexity, branding, alternative practices, and expanding markets. A transformative education shifts the conventional proficiencies to better engage contemporary challenges. We move from the individual to the collaborative, from the programming to the advanced research methods, from finite structures to systems thinking, from history to storytelling, and from professional practice to more entrepreneurial models. And this, I would offer, is something that happens late in an undergrad or in a graduate education. So, back to the model. It's been said that the 21st century will be the century of imagination and ideas. Architects are uniquely poised to make significant contributions during this time, but only if we transform our outdated individual genius pedagogical models that only incrementally improve our world to more complex collaborative models that redefine contemporary problems and propose more transformative solutions. So Alan, here's my last sentence, which has been shifted a bit because of the thing, but it's that I think, certainly at the design school, we believe that tomorrow's architects will have to harness their unique ability to lead collaborations, to synthesize complex problems through qualitative and quantitative approaches, and be agents of transformation that help redefine the public good.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Now to Kim Tanzer. Kim Tanzer, FAIA, Dean, and Edward Elson Professor of Architecture at the University of Virginia. Prior to Virginia, she served as Professor of Architecture in Florida, University of Florida. Her teaching and research is focused on the relationship between the human body and large shared spaces with an emphasis on creating sustainable environments. She has worked extensively in Gainesville, particularly on the Fifth Avenue, Pleasant Street historically African-American neighborhood, received much recognition for this work from the Florida Humanities Council and worked on a PBS documentary dealing with the area. She's received many other awards, including the ACSA Collaborative Practice Award and the Robert Taylor Award. Kim has served as president of ACSA in 2007-08, and during her tenure she initiated the process for creating an interdisciplinary National Academy of Environmental Design. Kim Tanzer.
Thank you. And my last sentence is first, architectural education as a mean to informed positive change. Since we're on the Pacific Rim today, I'm going with the metaphor of balance, and so my very modest images are from the Pacific Rim. One of my favorite books, the I Ching, or the Book of Changes. Just a nod to what several of you have spoken about, summarized in a very assertive way by Mark Taylor in The Crisis on Campus, about the role of higher education in its context, because I think it's always the case that we need to be thinking to the next larger scale, and there are many next larger scales. Darren just identified several, but certainly for all of us, this is one of them. So I will first argue for 5 or 6 themes that I believe should run through architectural education, and then propose a skeletal curriculum. The first theme is to understand, improve, teach, and disseminate design thinking, also described as lateral thinking or creativity or abductive thinking. Some have talked about it as the lateral bar in the T-shaped thinking, which connects things. We do this very well. We do it intuitively. Very few of us are very good at explaining what that is or how it works so well or why we teach it, or at advocating why we're very good at contributing that to larger groups. And I think IDEO has been as successful as they have because they basically captured the market early in terms of trying to describe it. The second bar in T-shaped thinking is the vertical bar, and that would be described generally as research. We need to enhance our knowledge base through feedback loops, which is research. I think the question of what research is within an architectural school is something that's still being debated and developed. I think as someone who does not have a PhD after her name, it's important that we think about the depth of knowledge, and that if we don't have that depth ourselves, we need to bring people to the table who do have it and respect what they bring to our work. And that leads me to a third point. We need to continue to, as several have said, assemble interdisciplinary groups, perhaps as consultancies. That means not forever, but as needed, utilizing many types of intelligence to design projects beyond the scale of the buildings, as well as, of course, building scale projects at the same time. We need to be mindful of the fact that historically, not just in the current field, but according to NCARB, who knows this data, if anyone does, or if any group does, 50% of the people who graduate with professional degrees choose not to become licensed architects. That's not just because we have current problems with the economy or with the test is being delivered and so forth. It's just that there are lots of other great things one can do with the design education, and it's important that we reflect on that and make sure that we're counting all of those folks among our graduates. We need to make sure that we're operating with local sensitivity, mindful of the world context, and I think we all know that in our hearts, but I think that as we move around the world doing projects and so forth, it's sometimes easy to forget how subtle different cultures are, whether they're in other parts of the globe or even in our own communities. And so that's a skill that we need to cultivate, or a sensitivity. We need to take charge of the future, entrepreneurship. I'm teaching a course myself right now on design entrepreneurship, mostly because, as many of you, when I want to learn something, I teach about it. And so I'm learning about how design thinking applies to marketing and money and other things like, and markets and things like that. So it turns out that a few years ago, my colleague Rafael Longoria and I had the opportunity to put together an edited volume, which is entitled The Green Braid, Toward an Architecture of Ecology, Economy, and Equity. And our intention was to focus on essays that related to sustainability that came out of conference proceedings from the ACSA over a number of years. I think some of you in the audience are included in this volume. And we categorize those into 5 groups, which I kind of began to think of as a potential curriculum. And I'll save the first to last. The second is phenomena and technology, which begins to marry the technical aspects of ET, the subject I didn't do so well in, with phenomena such as sunlight, moonlight, wind, rain, and so forth, which I love. And so putting those together and thinking about those. A second group is building practices. This has to do with both the materials of construction and how they're put together. I think Paolo's lecture last night was a great example of the importance of how we put things together and how that's context specific. A third, settlement patterns, has to do with moving out in scale from the building to the site, the neighborhood, the city, the region, the globe. And of course, in sustainability, how those things are put together are much more impactful than things that happen at the scale of the building unless it's scaled out by multiples. And the shared realm, which has to do with how we relate to each other within our communities across the globe and to non-human parts of our shared realm as well. And then leaving the first, going back to the first, we describe meta-discourses in pedagogy and practice, which has to do with changing the way we think about what we do, how we practice. That has to do with entrepreneurship. It has to do with design-build projects. It has to do with rethinking what we do rather than trying to get to a new result, as Einstein would say, using the tools that created, the situation we're in now. So as a closing question, of course, you all know this diagram, 3 blind men and an elephant. None of us know what our elephant will look like, and so I've tried to provide you a few examples of some things I think will help us in a balanced way to address the questions we face and to give our tools, our students the tools they need to find out how to come to terms with the elephant that they will face in their lives. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Moving on to Hernan Diaz Alonso. Hernan Diaz Alonso is graduate program chair at SciArc, as well as principal and founder of the Los Angeles-based practice which cannot easily be pronounced.
Welcome to the club. We have jackets for people.
Zephyrotorum.
Yeah, close enough.
Close, good. Prior to this, Diaz Alonso was distinguished professor of architecture and graduate thesis coauthor at SciArc. He has lectured extensively, and his work has been widely published in magazines and books. His designs have received numerous awards and is part of the permanent collections of the Frack Center in San Francisco, MoMA, and the Art Institute of Chicago. Hernan.
I always have the feeling that in architecture, since probably Palladio, we will keep saying that these are very difficult times for architecture. These are complicated times. What we should do. I mean, it seems like it's embedded with the tradition of our discipline, almost in parallel to the regular whining that comes with architects. So I don't think it's going to get any easier. I don't think ever was easy. So in any case, without the ambition to claim that there's any sense of manifesto, actually I spent the last 10 years of my academic career argue that my generation belongs to a non-manifesto generation, and here I am trying to pose a manifesto. Okay, so my non-manifesto manifesto should be something like along these lines. Architecture is a curious discipline. It's a complicated one because I always try to operate in the present, but keep referring to the past and keep aspiring to the future. So if you're a progressive, radical, school, architect, thinker, practice, you try to focus your argument towards the future. But if you want to have gravitas and relevance, you keep quoting the past. So it seems like to any kind of ambition of a manifesto to the future is about to try to find that balance and how we try to operate within that balance. Now, these are confusing times, but as I just Felix Herman Hoffman reminds us, they always are. So that was 1974 when the rock and roll was already dead, and it still remains dead and it still remains alive. So the idea that I don't think the manifesto can cause it anymore, but I don't want to convince you of this. I'm sure you, I don't want to discourage you of keep trying with the manifesto notion. But one of the things I think what we need to understand right now is whatever thing we think that we're doing and whatever thing how amazing it is and new it is, the truth is it's never quite the case. Architecture predicates I don't know, the most radical value I would say have to do with innovation and not necessarily with newness. I don't think architecture is capable to produce anything new. At best, it's possible to produce something innovative, because this problem I'm trying to talk about the notion of the rooted of the melancholy of historical past, but at the same time with ambition moving to the future. Part of the problem I will say at large is, or at least I like to think about it, is that one of the main problems right now is I think more than ever, the bridge between profession and discipline is growing farther and farther apart. And to me, that is a fundamental problem that we need to face as a discipline at large. I realize I almost talk more from the discipline than from the practice, but I don't think that should be so detached. And I think architecture at best, or the best times for any kind of this notion, were when those moments, when those logics were not so apart from each other, but it seems like we're much more closer. So I would argue that that's one of the things that in schools and in discussions about education architecture, we should need to get back to that. Now, that being said, I also think that architecture at the end of the day is like a large conversation, and the only thing that you can do in any institution, program, or school is to try to identify in a specific and important, and hopefully important part of the larger architectural conversation that right now, as we know, is at a critical inflection point, but probably, as I mentioned, it was the case 20 years ago, 40 years ago, and 100 years ago. So for me, it's important once in a while to don't carry away on that. I mean, the 21st century have all this problem of gravitas and the way that it comes with those slogans, but at the same time, the problem sometimes remains always the same. So as I was saying, architecture is an individual input into a collective conversation. Now, the conversation that is happening now, it happens in a lot of different places, and it doesn't all up to a nice, neat discourse. First, you have to choose what kind of architects you want to be, what kind of a school you want to be, and what probably means that what conversation that you want to join to. That could mean anything from childhood dreams to recent desires. Even when we think that we'll figure it out, we will think it out away, and we should start again and again. Part of the problem I see in relation to this thing is, I think, at the specific problem of the discipline, we're still trapped by the ghost of modernism. Modernism still gives us the problem of meaning and the problem of justification and the problem of how we judge the work that we produce. I'm talking more about the discipline and at the academic level. And I would say in the professional level, I would argue it's even worse, because I think at the technological level, we keep improving, but it seems to me that the cultural paradigms in which architecture operates seems remains stuck from the 1940s. I know that may probably raise some question, but I really think that it's a fundamental part of the problem why I think the discipline has such troubles engaging with a much dynamic and alive culture in any other disciplines that we like to interact and have a communication. Now, for sure, the solution for any of this is not in any kind of religious techno-ethos called Parametrics or any of the other one that many of us we subscribe partially and we change 5 years after and 5 years after and 5 years after. Neither is the architecture gesture. As I said, it's a complicated balance. Every few years, things that we thought that were impossible turn out to be possible, and maybe the other way around. I think our job should be really not so much to show off that we can do a particular thing really well, though that is important, but that a particular thing that they can do they can and should move the line from impossible to possible in an original way. It's actually really hard. It's easy to come with something impossible. It's easy to come with something possible. What is really hard is to come up with something that people who are really smart and have been thinking about it for a long time can't actually tell if it's impossible or not. So, to conclude, and sort of a positive note, as the world oscillates between path forward that could lead variously to utopia or oblivion, this is an enormous and complicated time for architecture and an important moment to claim a renewed, positive, progressive, imaginative agenda. Architecture needs its own heroes, but more importantly, the situation needs architects. Sorry, I just move it out. Oh, sorry, I lost it. Not for on survival, but quite possible for the transformation that we can achieve with it. So, real last point, be optimistic, even if we think that the world is going to hell, then that only means it's our job to design an escape route for all of us. Thank you.
And I think Robert Somol is here somewhere. Robert Somol, Director of UIC.
Great. Thank you, Hernan. Thank you. Thanks. It's nice to be here, and I think there's a lot of overlaps in the talks already. I will rely on Norman to stop me at 5 minutes. It's great to be here, but I feel awful, and I want to publicly blame Andrew Zago for that. I suppose my manifesto, since this is the title, is called Synthetic Discipline, or 4.5 Earths Are Not Enough. And by synthetic discipline, I do want it to rhyme in a certain way with an alternative understanding, which would be integrated practice. So my view is synthetic, not integrated, and discipline, not practice. And if I have to give a one-word answer to Alan, I would say I would borrow from The Graduate and just say plastics. So that's really my manifesto, is plastics. I wanted to also set up, explain maybe why you're seeing 7 instead of 6 presentations, which is my fault in a way. In August, I was invited, and this was the invitation. The panel is called Pedagogical Manifestos. We'd like to give you a brief summation of what you think architects need to know. Great, I love manifestos, no problem. In October, this one came in, which is, the panel is called Challenges and/or Opportunities, and we ask you to present how architecture schools should respond to the challenges posed by changes, such as globalization, the environment, emerging technologies, social and economic equity, to name a few, from outside the field. So I thought this was quite different, and Margaret and Norman were kind enough to switch me back, although I do think that some of the same set of issues have also returned into this panel, let's say. And in particular, I guess it's these things that I want to talk about: globalization, environment, emerging technology, social and economic equity. In particular, say that they represent, in some sense, these sort of laundry list of themes represents a thematization of architectural education that I see as the problem. And I also think that these things are neither new nor outside the field. In other words, every thesis project for the last 20 years has dealt with one or more of these issues. There are numerous institutions that represent these interests, whether it's Acadia, Architecture for Humanity, Design Corps, USGBC. In other words, AIA committees, ACSA committees. These are the ways that you get grants and you get awards and you get promoted. These are the words you use. So in fact, it is deeply institutionalized. It's not outside and it's not new. Which I guess means that although I am a recent administrator, I find myself probably on the side of the old school. And Darren and I did not compare notes, but to me this is old school, where you could change the world, or maybe even more precisely, make any world with 3 colors and 1 shape. That's all you needed, plastics. And I guess the new school for me is actually Harry Potter's school. This is Harry Potter's school, and in some way I just want to say this is a stand-in for the thematization of architecture, or the thematization of architectural education. So we have the environment, we have green roofs now, we have fire, We have emergent technology. This really, the whole thing is really what I would call the BIMification of Legos, the preconditioning of the design by an overspecificity of the part. Of course, we have social equity and diversity. And the whole thing is really tied together by globalization, i.e. the global branding of a theme everywhere. And so this, to me, is the problem with a kind of thematic model of education. So old school, new school. Old school was cool, low definition, and high participation. It was clearly, explicitly artificial. It was intensive. You had to use a few things and use them a lot in order to get some difference out of it. The new school, I would say, is hot, super high definition, low participation. I think Darren was touching on this. It's not an artificial politics, but a naturalist politics. In fact, I've never seen an uglier set of colors that try to dissimulate material reality. Again, this is Revit over here on the right. And finally, a kit of parts. So I want to learn a little bit from Stanley Fish, whose book, maybe this will be a kind of corollary or different than the book that Kim showed, in terms of the job of education and the job of the academy. Inutility is a fact about academic work and a defining, not a limiting fact. An unconcern with any usefulness to the world is the key to its distinctiveness, and this unconcern is displayed not in the spirit of renunciation, but in the spirit of independence and of the marking of territory. His colleague, who is still at UIC, Fish was at UIC, is Walter Ben Michaels. Walter is a professor of English, but also actually an organizer for faculty unionization, very committed. And I think, but this issue, because I also am interested in architecture as politics and sort of the political economy of form, you could say, but I also think the question of how you act politically in architecture, through architecture, and I would say as distinct from architecture as art or science. I think Walter sort of hits on this. I won't read the whole quote, but in his essay, The Beauty of a Social Problem, which just came out. In other words, that the indifference, or autonomy's indifference, he says, is politically helpful. Goes on. Today we might speculate it's only insofar as art seeks to be beautiful. He's talking about a photographer. Seeks to achieve formal perfection imaginable in works of art, but not in anything else, that it can also function as a picture not of how, if we behaved better, we might manage capitalism's problems, but rather of capitalism as itself a problem. I guess I want to maybe extend that by a historian, theorist, philosopher of science, Paul Feyerabend. Knowledge is not the gradual approach to truth. The task of the scientist is, quote, to make the weaker case the stronger, as the sophist said. We need a set of alternative assumptions, or, as it were, an entire alternative world. We need a dream world in order to discover the real world we think we inhabit, and which may actually be just another dream world. We must invent a new conceptual system that suspends or clashes with the most carefully established observational results and introduces perceptions that cannot form part of the existing perceptual world. Feyerabend ultimately calls this project counterintuitive or counterinductive, and I think that counterintuition is the one thing that we actually can teach our students, and I would say to build a program around the exaggeration and of counterintuition would be part of this synthetic discipline model. In other words, we all know what this image is supposed to mean. It means that we feel bad, that if we all consumed like North Americans, we'd need 4+ Earths. But I think you also have to look at the image as you would as a designer and basically say, you know what, that's a pretty cool image, we need more Earths. In other words, the idea really is how do you read the facts against the grain of the way in which everything is pointing us? How can we understand that architecture is a form of world making and that it's our job to make new worlds? So given that we're in Hollywood, I thought I would refer to both Dirty Harry and James Bond with a slight inflection and say that a la Dirty Harry, a discipline's got to know its limitations, but also 4.5 Earths are not enough. So that, in other words, we can only be political through an intensive investment within the discipline's limits, through the rigorous applications of its techniques and methods, and that we need to be both understand those limits and be very much in control of those techniques, and at the same time be more ambitious. So in a certain sense, I want precision and ambition, as opposed to, I think, what we see a lot of today, which is sloppiness with good intents. And so the 5-point manifesto that I will conclude with is, this is from our recently published catalog of the school, which has these 5 manifesto points: perverse precision, novel repetition, organized surprise, denatured environments, and plastic politics. And I think the important thing is that each one needs to rely on a particular trope that's already within the field. So in other words, how do we rethink geometry and form, or precedent and type, program and lifestyle, ecologies and energies, the city and collective association. That, in a sense, this idea of how we counterintuitively read the discipline against its grain to produce these new alternative worlds. And these are just the final images from the catalog, of which there are more work in it. But I think the first one, perverse precision, already suggests that, maybe this is a debate with Dagmar, that we are essentially a representational field. We are essentially a paper practice. That's what architecture is. And how can we, in a sense, start to produce graphic, textual, and written arguments that would reimagine the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert. We have a few minutes, I believe, and I think we can take questions. I need you to ask questions in order to sort out what I've just heard. I mean, it's been an immensely rich and dense set of presentations, so please, thoughts. Tease the audience. Yes. Yes. Huh?
Thank you. Great presentations. Francisco Rodriguez, Dean of the University of Puerto Rico School of Architecture. One of the things that would be tough to do by doing a presentation from up there, is to assume that that these new positions or these new manifestos can actually come from the university, can actually come from a traditional university. I agree with Hernan that things are changing at a rate, or technology is changing at a rate, that we may not be able to digest. We may not be trained to digest. And in the traditional university system, where we still teach with the traditional sort of master, apprentice, atelier situation that may have worked together, they may have come together with the tenure system of the 30 years of a professor being in a place, that may have worked in a particular time when technology and the teaching may have worked with those parentheses of those periods of 30 years. But I don't think that's no longer possible. So I think designing the future from the traditional university system may be wishful thinking in many ways. I think it might operate the other way around. I think it's going to be designed from the outside in, from desire more than anything else. When you have programs like Erasmus, where you can actually choose a university to go to for every year, so you can go to Barcelona 1 year, Paris 1 year, Madrid 1 year, and Milan another year, it's the student who's choosing to be with a particular professor who teaches a particular way of thinking, and he is designing, or she is designing, his or her own education. Is that the end of the question? So
You're being attacked.
So I agree with in many ways with what Hernan was saying, that this is, on the one hand rooted in the ghost of modernism, but on the other hand, experiencing these changes of every 5 years, that I don't know if we are designed with the university, with the traditional university structures to deal with.
It was more a statement than a question, I guess. and we probably will ponder it. Huh? Next question. No.
Darius Solahub, Director of the New Jersey School of Architecture. This is a question to Kim and Dan, because they cited the data, but it could go to Dan Petrucci, too. I think he would be able to answer that. Kim, you said that 50%, according to NAIB, 50% of students don't go on to licensure, and the assumption is that cohort goes on to other design-oriented areas of activity. And Dan, the 100% of that, 30% of those are now currently unemployed. So in this new school, how do we build in the latitude, again, trying to meet NAB standards and NCARB and all of that towards licensure, but still build in latitude to move into professions? How do we build that in? And then what is the breadth of those? Can those students go to medicine? Can those students go to law? Can they go to bioscience?
In our school, there are people who are venture capitalists and go on to be lawyers and web designers and politicians and all kinds of things like that. And the folks who report back all credit their education in design as key to their success. And so I think that it's a really good question, and it has to do with, do we differentiate the curriculum at a certain point so that someone who figures out that they don't want to ultimately to practice law doesn't have to take that final structures class and instead take something else. I think that some folks in here have talked about the fact that with more precise record keeping, it might be possible to meet NAB requirements in ways other than the lockstep everyone in the third year takes the structures class kind of way that we've done in the past, so that people could achieve NAB requirements and do other things as well. That's just one suggestion.
The other Dan.
We buy into a set of assumptions when we agree to organize our curricula around these conditions and procedures and student performance criteria. Until the accreditation review process acquires the courage to perturb those assumptions, we're stuck in that cycle, which means we're stuck in the idea that our central mission is the production of professionals, by which we mean licensed architects. Now, I speak for public higher education when I say that's the assumption the taxpayer makes when he supports the school. If we want a different model, if we want to remove that underlying assumption and just turn the curricula loose, I think it would have very interesting outcomes. But for the time being, we're duty-bound to work through and evaluate those criteria as best we can in consideration of these economic trends, which are increasingly grim.
I was going to maybe just flip that on its head a little bit. Another way to also look at it, I think, is, and I know we struggle with this at now the largest university in the United States, at Arizona State University, the value of design to the rest of the university. And so in the same way in which many designers leave their education and go and do other things, we're trying to have impact on those other things as designers. So for example, biomimicry studios that are taught with biologists and faculty from biology, or healthcare wellness studios that are taught with nurses from nursing, because we're finding that it's a way of entering into other fields in a backdoor way that expands our ability to have impact in those fields. And so biodesign is a big area. Why are we not there? The word design is in it. So I think that it's a both and. It's one, how are we training our students to go off and change the world in ways that might not just be about a building, but also how can we come in as designers and impact those other areas? And I think that's a role that we tend to, historically in architecture programs, eat in prison, and we need to think differently about that.
As you assembled your manifestos, whether you gave any thought to who our students are, and whether in the context of old school, new school, is there a new student?
For Darren, definitely.
Yeah, I think so.
I got you.
Okay. Cool, I'm done.
I'm thinking of the data that looks at the, if we kind of look, with cold-eyed precision, we're not a very diverse profession. I'm wondering whether the transformation of the curriculum is going to open our doors to a much broader segment of the population.
I'll just start, and I'm sure others thought about it at least as much as I did or more, but I think that for our profession to take advantage of all the talent that we have in the United States and beyond, we need to get the best of every kind of person in the door. And I think that things like being able to, take charge and make a difference are more important for people who come from communities that do not currently feel that they're in charge, and so we need to provide opportunities for them. That, for me, is where social justice and entrepreneurship come into the equation.
But in relation to this, what you're asking about, if there is a new student, I will say that yes, there is a kind of a new student, and I think it's just going to accelerate in the sense of, I think the notion of accumulation and distribution of knowledge is changing by the minute, in the sense of already our 18th to 29th, which is between undergrad and grad, what the school like SIA has, already they are part of a culture that they come from a kind of a fragmented understanding of knowledge, which it goes of accumulation of a lot of bits, but more often than not, lack of depth in the understanding. That I'm not arguing that the old classical library hours, that deep knowledge was better. I mean, it was better in certain aspects, it's worse in another aspect. I'm just saying it's different, and there is a different nature of how they operate and how they try to accumulate and understand knowledge. And my sense is that it's complicated for every discipline, but I will say for architecture it's particularly complicated because the nature of the slowness and the tradition of slow movement that the discipline has, I think I have a hard time to adapt to that. But my question will be in relation to that is, if the discipline needs to adapt to that, or it needs to really remain in the apparent slowness and making a strength out of that, and figure it out how this very fast to accumulate bits of knowledge can become part of a different way to understand this kind of a tradition of depth. So to me, that's one of the key of the struggle with the current notion of education and the way that the students are. And the only reason I know is just going to get more aggressive like that because I have a 3-year-old daughter which already knows how to navigate her iPad in the same time that it took her mother or me to understand how to navigate it. So that doesn't make her smarter than a 3-year-old kid of 50 years ago, but it certainly makes it different because, as I said, the depth of how we accumulate knowledge is completely different, and how we need to reorganize that is complicated, but I would say it's almost antithetical to the tradition of the discipline. You know what I mean? Like if you're in nanotechnology, it seems like a natural fit. So how we negotiate with that is up for grabs.
Yeah, I think that, the question, maybe it underlies a larger theme, which is this issue of to what extent should architecture be beholden to some sense of reality? And what we're talking about is the reality now of a particular population or constituency. I frankly don't believe it should, which should be clear. In other words, I think, the complaint that architects or teachers or theorists or critics, whoever the species is, you don't know what you're talking about. You don't know what's real. It's like, we need to say, you're right, we don't know what we're talking about. And that's not a defect, that's a job description. We actually don't know what we're talking about. In fact, in architecture, talking is what makes it real. And in fact, if you think you're modeling reality, then you're in the model of a service profession, or when in fact what you need to do is say, I'm going to speculate, build it and they will come, and essentially produce an audience that we don't know that exists yet. So for me, all of the data and all the statistics about a certain generational trends, I have to, we all have to confront that every day. When I want to start a new program, they say, where's the data on this? How many jobs are going to be for that? And it's like, I don't know. It's a new program. This thing doesn't exist yet, and we're not going to know the data until we throw it out there and figure it out. So I'm really skeptical of the world of metrics, No Child Left Behind, including that metric that we're entering into. And I think, we need to basically produce alternatives and let a new audience gravitate toward it, and let the chips fall where they will, basically.
I want to, obviously it's a great question, gives everybody a different thing to say. I'm going to answer it by possibly quoting or misquoting Dagmar, not in what you said today. But no, I realized a couple of years ago that all the innovation we were doing was in programs that were outside of or at the margins of the NAB curriculum, whether it was undergraduate or post-professional or on one side or the other. And what's been interesting, and this is, I'm getting to the quote, what's been interesting for me is the very different populations that those address. The thing that caused me to remember a remark of Dagmar's was, I just taught an undergraduate studio this semester for the first time in over a decade, and I, in a group in the studio, have 2 men and then, 12 women in the group. The undergraduate population is dominated by women in our program at the moment. And I remember Dagmar in a public lecture a number of years ago saying she used to be very upset about the percentage of women in the profession, and then she thought about it differently, or came to see it a little bit differently, and realized that women were actually a bit smarter, and in fact had made decisions about the narrow description of what was architectural practice, and were choosing other forms of design practices that perhaps were not so narrowly defined. So I do think that the broader question of the constraints that both the expectation of producing a certain kind of professional and even more the constraints of the NAAB curricula are ones that we all struggle against just as much as the different audiences that we offer programs to. They come and they pay us money and they take these programs. They see the same limitations. So I hope I quoted you correctly.
We have just a few minutes left, and I've been asked to make some closing remarks from the long view. And I mean, it really is it's an extremely complex picture. But two or three stories. I grew up in Scotland and went to school in a very socialist Scotland, and I had an education in which, you know, the modern project was a political project, and the only things that architecture should design are schools and houses, and we should worry really about creating new societies, and it was self-effacing. It was not subjective. It was a kind of public mission, and the manifestos for this were very easy. I mean, these were manifestos that you could easily believe in. And I arrived in Princeton almost directly from, actually I went to work in London with the LCC, building workers, public housing. I arrived in Princeton and arrived in the company of Michael Graves, Peter Eisenman, and Louis Kahn. And I mean, I thought this was the most decadent world I could possibly have entered. I mean, it makes no sense at all. I mean, Kahn's manifesto was look at Piranesi. Graves had this astonishingly Mozartian gift in which he internalized and trivialized everything. It was astonishing. Eisenman now, what is extraordinary about Eisenman is how this absolutely absurd set of propositions that he's had with them all his life, because of the strength of his intellect, and my God, mine is wonderful, we all subscribe to. I mean, so there is, you know, whether we like it or not, within this culture, the dominance of some compelling imaginations, and then that was particularly true when I arrived at the AA. I mean, I don't know, I mean, getting to the AA itself was interesting, but when I arrived, I realized I was the only person with any permanence. I could fire everyone. But I had to make sure we paid the bills. And I used to stand at the window watching people come through the door. I mean, it was $2 million in debt. And the task, I was told, was clear. You've got to have enough stuff around that people want to pay money to get. Didn't matter about any moral value, just make sure it's interesting. Make sure it's also the new. The new was awfully important. And I actually had ads in Race Magazine that had the new come to the AA. And I would have these people lining up, and I would decide what seemed interesting and not interesting. And hopefully, I mean, and sometimes I got it right. I mean, people like FOA or Van Berkel or Villaret, I mean, they all, because this was the place you actually bought the new. Now, what is terribly obvious about our discipline is it's so unstable. It's the most undisciplined discipline imaginable. I mean, we're reeds in the winds of fashion, continually changing. And in a sense, that is what we are. In a sense, we're widely reaching. I don't necessarily like it. I mean, it troubles me to say this, but we are irrepressibly open imaginations to all kinds of possibilities. Some of them make a difference. Some highly subjective, absurd propositions become gloriously public. Witness Mr. Gehry, and many other extremely well-meaning, pretty well-meaning intentions simply fall by the wayside. We are in this, however, in these imaginings, we make so many possibilities available that the future is enriched by it, no matter how unstable and uneven. Now, this makes the job of the schools very difficult, but I'm afraid it's hard to see any way through it if we really are honest about our world in the last several decades. Lastly, the piece that is interesting is for me, I mean, I was thinking, manifesto, it's a sort of political position, a public position. It's extraordinary how the subjective has become the public in so many ways. I mean, this is the most creative time in our field, and yet it makes no sense at all. Very good panel. Thank you all very much indeed.